So we're back here at 2nd Street, and we're about to do part 1 of the Fall River Cult murders. So what we're going to do is we're just going to kind of talk you through it. We're going to go over all the characters and give you the main story. And after that, we're going to delve into the characters a little bit more. We also have some interviews that we're going to show you. And that's going to be part 1. You ready?
Let's do this. Yeah.
So on October 13th of 1979, 2 women, it was 7:30 in the morning, and they were walking the track at Diamond Vocational Technical School, High School in Fall River, and they discovered a body under the bleachers. So it looked as though the hands and feet had been bound with twine and fishing line. The clothes had been removed except for the shirt. The skull had been crushed. So the police put together a composite photo, and within 48 hours, her father had identified her as Doreen Ann Levesque, a 17-year-old girl from New Bedford. Now, the medical examiner's report, he found stab wounds in the back of the skull. He believed that it was probably more than one person who had committed the murder. He also said that the mutilation of the body actually showed that it may have had ritual elements to it. And she was actually a prostitute on Bedford Street as well. And he also claimed that it looked as though she had been tortured and stoned to death.
On January 26th, a man was training his hunting dogs in the woods behind Resco Printing. His dogs caught onto a scent and he followed. He was led to a small ravine where the body of a woman was discovered. It was 22-year-old Barbara Raposa. Barbara and Doreen Levesque worked the streets of Fall River together. She was reported missing by her boyfriend, Andy Maltese. Andy was brought in for questioning. He told police that he had been a Satanist but had converted to Christianity. He even brought a Bible with him to the interrogation. He said that Doreen, himself, and Barbara were a part of the same satanic cult, and that it was the satanic cult that had killed Doreen Levesque. Andy Maltese was 42 years old and still lived at home with his mother. He was a pedophile, a sexual sadist, and a violent rapist. And we're going to get into more of that later on.
So 2 days later, Andy Maltese calls the police and tells them that he has 2 girls that know what happened in Doreen's murder. So he brings them in, and he claims that they were part of the same satanic cult that he and Barbara had belonged to. One was Karen Marsden. She was a 20-year-old prostitute and a single mother. The other was Robin Murphy, who was a 17-year-old prostitute. So Karen starts to tell them, about Carl Drew, and he was the one that killed Doreen Levesque. And then she tells him a little bit more about his background. Now, Carl Drew actually moved to Fall River from New Hampshire to escape an abusive father. He became a pimp, a Satanist, a drug user, an extremely violent man. Now, he used to threaten the girls. He would say to them, if you don't obey me, Satan is going to take his toll. There was another prostitute that had actually been arrested, and the woman that was responsible for her arrest, Carl Drew said he was going to kill her. He was going to tie her to a tree, sacrifice her, and pour blood all over her body. He was a very violent man, and he actually liked to, terrorize these girls to keep them in their place.
On February 5th, Andy Maltese claimed to have had a psychic dream. He calls the police department. He was able to give details, the exact location of the body. Now, these were details not yet released to the public. He's promptly arrested. Andy Maltese was not the sharpest tool in the shed. Now we're going to introduce a few more characters. Maureen Sunny Sparta. She was an ex-prostitute in Fall River, and she lived in Harbor Terrace Housing Project. She would hold satanic meetings in her apartment. She even had this picture of Satan above her couch. Now, some of the people attending these meetings were Robin Murphy, Doreen Levesque, Karen Marsden, Carl Drew, among others. She said that they would chant "Hail Satan" and that you could feel his presence in the room. And some people say that Carl Drew would start to break out in tongues. Robin Murphy, Karen Marsden, Doreen Levesque, Carl Drew. Sonny said that they would chant "Hail Satan," and they would actually feel his presence in the room. And then Carl Drew would break out in speaking in tongues.
So Carol Fletcher was another prostitute that worked the street with Doreen and Robin. And then there was another one, Mildred Jukes, better known as Cookie. These nicknames they give these girls, it's like crazy. But anyway, so Cookie had told police that Karen had told her that this cult that she was in, the satanic cult, they would take people to the Freetown State Forest and they would kill them. They had a sacrifice tree where they would hang them and pour blood on them before they died. So Karen Marsden continued to call the police and tell them that she was worried that Carl Drew was going to kill her. She claims that Robin Murphy had taken her to the Freetown State Forest, and they went down a dirt road and then off to the side, and there was a table there, almost looked like a stone altar, and she told her, she said, if you talk, this is where Carl Drew will sacrifice your soul to Satan. He also told her that he would inject battery acid into her veins and dump her in the green water next to the altar. So Karen Marsden was fearing for her life, the life of her son JJ, who was in foster care, and her grandmother whom she lived with. So 2 weeks after Barbara's body was found, Robin Murphy calls police and tells them that she was present when Barbara was murdered. And this is the report that she gave. She claims she called Andy for a ride. He picked her up. He was very angry at Barbara because she had cheated on him, but they went and they picked up Barbara. And then Barbara got in the front seat, Robin was in the back seat, and they began to argue. And Barbara flew over into the back seat, and they were fighting, and Robin bit her. So Andy pulls the car over, broke up the fight, dragged Barbara out of the car, and then Robin claims that he went into the trunk and got out his little bag of sex toys that he always carried around, and that they had sex. Robin claims she stayed in the car. She said she thought she saw Barbara's hands tied, and that Andy took a rock and smashed her head. He got back in the car and he said to her, let's see you crawl home from here. So the next morning he called Robin and he said, how's Barbara? And Robin's like, I don't know how she is. Apparently he would abuse girls quite often. He would always call Robin the next day and he would say, how is so-and-so? And Robin would always tell him, I don't know. Now Robin ended up taking the police that day to the crime scene, and on that same day Karen Marsden was reported missing by her grandmother. So Andy, of course, now they have a witness, so he was arrested, and then Robin was put in protective custody and sent to Texas to stay with a friend. So meanwhile, police are investigating Karen Marsden's disappearance. Well, numerous people came forward and said that Robin had told them that she had murdered Karen. So Robin herself, while she was in Texas, decides to call Sonny. And I guess she had been drinking and she was kind of high, and she called her up and she said, Sonny, I killed Karen Marsden. I killed her for you, because they had been lovers at one point. Then she said to her, she said, I did it like Lizzie Borden. I took all of my clothes off. Now, I think she was referring to the 1970s movie with Elizabeth Montgomery where she played Lizzie and she took all her clothes off to commit the murders. And there was another prostitute that came forward that said Karen had told her, Robin had told her that she murdered Karen. Karen's roommate from Texas actually heard the call and she was terrified. Now, Carl Drew had a girlfriend at the time named Leah, and he had told her as well that he had killed Karen Marsden, and he had given her a ring that actually turned out to be Karen's ring. Now, this is where it gets really crazy because Carol Fletcher calls the police and she tells them that she drove them all out the night that Karen was murdered. She said there was Carl Drew, there was Carl Davis, who was actually a pimp from New York, but was a friend of Carl Drew's, and he would come down to Fall River every now and then. And Robin was with them, and Karen. And she claims that she drove them all out to Westport, and that Carl Drew and Robin Murphy killed Karen. So of course, Robin, Carl Drew, and Carl Davis were all arrested because now they have a witness. So in order for Robin to testify, she was given something that might kind of get her to talk a little bit more. They offered her a charge of second-degree murder. She would go to prison for 15 years, but then she would be eligible for parole. And that was for her testimony in all 3 murders. So Robin reported that Doreen's murder was an offering of the soul to Satan. Now, Carl Drew was mad because Doreen did not want to work for him. So he picked her up one night and Robin was in the car. We have another character, Willie Smith, who was apparently another Satanist and a friend of Carl Drew's. He was in the car as well. They forced Doreen into the car. They drove to the Diamond Vocational High School. Robin claims that Willie and Carl took Doreen out of the car and dragged her under the bleachers and came back a few minutes later. And Robin asked what happened to Doreen, and Carl Drew said, "You don't want to know." But that testimony was inconsistent with what the medical examiner had found, because he said she would have heard something because it showed torture and stoning and a very bloody death. Now, Karen also claims that Robin had a big part in this murder as well, and that she instructed everyone to take part in the mutilation of the body. So now on to Karen's murder. So Karen had been thinking about moving to Florida with her new boyfriend, and this kind of angered Robin. And she also knew a lot because, remember, she was at Doreen Levesque's murder and she was starting to talk to the police. So on the night that she was murdered, she was sitting in the car with Carol Fletcher and they were chatting, and then Karen went off with a customer, and then Carol went and picked up Robin, and then they went back and they picked up Karen. And Carol said, "Well, I have to go talk to Carl Davis. I gotta ask him a question or whatever." So they went off again and they picked up Carl Drew and Carl Davis. And they drove to a secluded area behind a ball pond in Westport, stopped the car, and Carl said to her, he said, "I told you that Satan would get you. Your time has come." And he instructed Robin to hit her and to drag her out of the car, which she did. And Karen said to Carol, she said, "Please make sure," this kind of hurt my heart because my grandson's name is JJ, but she said, "Please don't let anything happen to JJ." And she looked at Carl Drew and she said, "God will take care of me no matter what you do to me." So then they dragged her into the woods over by a stone wall, and he told everyone to pick up stones and throw them at her. So, of course, Carl Davis and Carol weren't really into it, so they picked up a small stone and kind of flung it at her head. And then, of course, Robin and Carl threw stones at her as well. Carl took her clothes off. He cut her hand off because he wanted to get her rings. He had Robin perform oral sex on her. Then he gave Robin a knife and he said, "Slit her throat." And she did. She slit her throat and she cut through the muscles and she cut through the tendons, and then he proceeded to pull her head off of her body. He gives Robin the head and he said, "Pull the hair out," which she did. Then he says to her, "Cut the eyes out," and she said, "I don't know how." He took the head and then he started to kick it around like a football. He then carved an X in Karen's stomach, and he began speaking in tongues, and Robin had seen him do this previously at meetings that they had had and at Doreen's murder as well. And then he took some of Karen's blood, he marked an X on Robin's forehead, and he said, "Now you're one of us." So they left, and she went back to Sonny's house and ate a chicken dinner, and smoked a joint. Although she claims the entire time she wasn't in control of her mind or her body. But she could eat a chicken dinner and smoke a joint.
Yeah. Unbelievable.
So Karen's skull was found, but her body was never found. Robin claims that they burned her body. They only found some of her clothes, one of her shoes, and her skull. So her grandmother, along with the funeral director, they didn't have any services for her, but she had her skull buried at Oak Grove Cemetery, which is where the Bordens are buried. And it's kind of ironic because they had their heads cut off and their skulls are buried above their bodies, and that's where Karen's skull was buried.
It's a second Borden reference today.
Yep. So Robin was given her deal. She got second-degree murder, and in 15 years she would be eligible for parole. Carl Drew went to prison for life. Carl Davis actually got off on everything, but it's kind of ironic because a year later he went after Sonny Marsden and he stabbed her and beat her, and she was 3 months pregnant. He went to jail for 7 years for that, and now he's out running around. Willie and Carol were actually released, and there were no charges against them. And they never brought any charges against the murder of Doreen because they figured Carl Drew was already in jail, Robin was already in jail. What was the point of bringing all that up again? So they never had a trial for the murder of Doreen Levesque, and Willie just got off scot-free.
That's awful closure for those families.
Right, exactly. Like it was never, all of them actually weren't prosecuted. So, yeah, Robin ended up being eligible for parole. She did get out, but she violated her parole and ended up back in prison. Her girlfriend at the time, I guess they had gotten stopped by the police or whatever, and she had drugs in the car, and she was a known felon. So she was put back in prison, and she's still in there now. And I think that's pretty much the end. She actually recanted her testimony, and I guess, when you sit in prison for a while, you just decide you don't want to be guilty anymore, and you recant all your testimony, even though all the evidence points towards you. Carl Drew always said that he was innocent, and nope, never did any of that. All right, so now I want to take a closer look at the characters and their personalities and why they were the way they were, just to maybe try to make a little bit of sense out of this whole thing. So we're going to start with Carl Drew. So he grew up on a farm in New Hampshire. His father was a very abusive alcoholic, and he would make Carl hold the killing knife and slit the throats of the animals, and then he would actually make him drink the blood of these animals.
Oh,
he would make him go down into the slaughter pit to get the hides and the hoofs. He was just, you can imagine a small boy and all of these things happening to him. At one point, their horse they had had a fire in the barn, and the horse died, and he gave him the knife and told him to cut up the horse. Well, of course he didn't want to, so his father started slapping him and backed him into a pit that he fell into. Now, there's more, but you get the general idea. I don't even want to...
No wonder he had her
Right.
slit the throat and the
Exactly, yeah. So he, of course, moved to Fall River and became a pimp and a drug addict and a Satanist with very, very violent tendencies. Oh, and we also have an interview. Carrie, one of our other awesome tour guides,
Mm-hmm.
had her parents had a run-in with Carl Drew, so we're going to show you her interview. All right, so back here at 2nd Street, we have another one of our awesome tour guides, Carrie. Carrie had a really interesting story about Carl Drew that she's going to tell us.
Okay, so back in that time, my mother and father and my aunt and uncle did know him. They went to the Pier 14, which was a bar down on Bedford Street. And what happened was they were in the bar, and Carl Drew had reached into his bottom of his ankle, and he pulled out a big butcher knife. And he went to stab my uncle. It was, my mother got scared, so my father and my uncle had pushed my aunt away and my mom away, and Carl chased them outside. you know, and that's when my father and my uncle got into a fight with him, and he kept like jumping up. He ripped his shirt off, my dad said, and he said, "You can't kill me." He says, "I got the devil in me." And my father said he did have a tattoo. He has a tattoo of the devil on his chest, you know, and it was really scary. My father said he kept hitting him, he kept getting back up, like evil-eyed, like a vicious look. It was horrible. It was a very scary thing. Yes, it was terrible. But
So he was a really violent guy.
he was very violent because my parents didn't do anything to him. My aunt and uncle, they were trying to have a nice drink out for the night, and he came in and wanted to start a fight with them. It was
Wow.
horrible. Yeah, he was a
crazy.
very vicious person. It was like he just had no soul.
Right.
You know, he was just
Right.
terribly vicious. Yes.
Well, thank you so much for
You're
that
welcome.
story, Carrie.
You're welcome. And thank you.
All right, guys. So this is Bedford Street. This is where all the girls worked. This is where Carl Drew worked. I believe it was Pier 14. Sue and I think that it was this building right here. Or it could have possibly been that one. But it seems more likely it was this one. This is Bedford Street. Kind of ironic. The police department's right on the other side of this building.
So now we're going to look at Doreen LeBecq. She was 17 years old. She lived in New Bedford. She was from a family of 7 children. And her mother said she was in some program. It was the state's program for families in needs. Not really sure what children in need. I'm not really sure what that program is, but her mother claims that from the time she was 12 years old, she was in trouble. She got arrested for shoplifting. She ran away, she quit school, and she pretty much lived on the streets, and she would stay at different people's houses. Now, I don't know her family, and I'm not saying anything about them, but it just seems odd to me that she never wanted to be at home. You know, home is supposed to be your safe place, not a place that you want to run away from, and generally when children run away and do not want to be at home, there's something going on.
You know, it was the first thing I was thinking as you were saying that.
Mm-hmm.
That might not be something even the mother was aware of, but probably something was happening.
Right, yeah. So Karen Marsden, I couldn't find out a lot about her. She basically lived with her grandmother. She had her son JJ, who was in foster care, but she was allowed visitation. So I'm thinking, you know, she had a drug habit and she was a prostitute so that she could afford her drug habit. So I'm thinking her beginnings were not that great either.
Mhm.
Just a feeling that I have. So Andy Maltese, we said we were going to talk about him a little bit more. As Sue had said, he was 42 years old, still lived at home with his mother. He had quit school in the 7th grade. People said he wasn't really the brightest bulb in the bunch. But he was, you know, a pedophile, and he preyed on young girls. There was a 12-year-old girl in the neighborhood, and he would give her joints so she would have sex with him. And he also used to keep, according to Robin, a bag of sex toys in his trunk, and she said that he would also drug young prostitutes and take advantage of them as well. So he died in prison, thinking he was an agent for the police. He was extremely mentally ill. So Barbara Raposa, again, I couldn't find a picture of her or really any information, but she was Andy's girlfriend, so that kind of tells me something was off. So Robin Murphy. So Robin lived at Harbor Terrace, which was a really rough housing project in Fall River. She became a prostitute. And again, she was never home. She used to live at other people's houses, which definitely tells me again, you know, something was probably going on at home. And I totally lost my train of thought. So Robin had a very high IQ. Her IQ was 137. Her mom claims that she had a psychiatric eval done on her, and they were giving her some personality tests, and Robin's mother thinks she lied on the test because she didn't want to be diagnosed with a personality disorder. Now, she also claims when she was 11 years old, Andy Maltese picked her up hitchhiking and raped her. And she said he continued to do so for many years, and if he ever found out she was with somebody else, he would beat her. So she had a, pretty rough beginning, But we have an interview with another one of our great tour guides, Louise, and we're going to show that to you guys.
So we have another one of our awesome tour guides, Louise. Louise actually knew Robin, so she's going to talk a little bit about her. Now, Louise, how did you know Robin?
Okay, Robin went to high school with me. I believe it was my freshman year, and we had the same health and gym class together. So, yeah, that's basically how I knew her. Of her.
Yeah.
Describing Robin, the best way I can come up with is she was a pretty girl, very well liked, funny, brilliant, big doughy eyes, and just full of personality. So she was actually well liked and not the monster that people portray her to be, that I never knew about. So.
Now, what was the story about the health class that she told?
Okay, yeah, we were in a health class, and for some reason, the teacher, it was a sex ed class, and the teacher was talking about protection and things that you can do and take, and I don't know why she asked this, but she asked if there was anybody who was no longer a virgin in the class, and of course, there was a lot of snickering and laughter, stupid kids, right?
Mm-hmm.
And, yeah, so Robin raised her hand up right away, and everybody kind of like just looked at her because, it's kind of an embarrassing subject. And the teacher asked who, if she was still with the person, this or that, and she says, oh no, she goes, it was my brother.
Wow.
And I didn't even know she had a brother, and I don't know if the teacher ever brought that to the authorities, or what do you do with some kind of information like that?
Right.
But this was back in the 70s.
Yeah.
So.
Yep.
No. We all kind of remained stoic on that.
Yeah. So you guys used to smoke your cigarettes together?
Yeah. At the end of class, we used to, have cigarettes under a tree. Durfee was kind of like on a slope, and there was like a tree, and we would just chit chat between classes every now and then. And one day she just said, this life is pretty effed up, isn't it? And I didn't know what she was talking about because I was very naive, and and I had no idea what she was into.
Right.
And then for some point, she kind of disappeared. She hadn't come to school for a while, and there was rumor that she had gotten pregnant.
Mm-hmm.
And one day, I saw her and another girl walking up between the two buildings on Rock Street, and she had a pretty good-sized belly. Now, I don't know if she ever had the baby or what the story is with that, because it was never really spoken about during the trial.
So you think she probably had a pretty rough life?
Oh, well, she grew up in Harbour Terrace, so...
Yeah.
Anybody from there was like, that's the place you just did not hang around at. It was a bad place.
Yeah.
And, there's rumor that her father was abusive towards her, and of course, apparently her brother was as well.
Yeah.
And she just got mixed up with the wrong crowd.
Right.
She kind of didn't stay much with her parents, from what I was told. She kind of surfed sofas, so to speak, visiting different friends.
Yeah.
And, but she never, I would have never assumed that she could create such a heinous crime because of her personality. It was just sparkling and bubbly all the time.
Wow.
So, yeah.
Amazing. Oh.
Yep.
Well, thank you so much.
You're very welcome. I wish I had more for you, but I don't.
That's great. Thanks.
All right, thank you.
So just wanted to get you guys some footage of the Harbour Terrace, give you an idea of what that would look like. Robin lived here with her parents, and Sunny lived here as well. They were all part of the case. It's kind of down near, that's the water right over there, right, Sue?
Yep.
Yeah. Again, I just wanted to give you guys an idea of...
the housing project a lot of the story took place over here.
Yep. And Sunny would have her satanic meetings here for the cult as well.
So now I want to talk a little bit about childhood trauma, because I'm in the early childhood field, And what a lot of people don't realize is that if you have that ongoing trauma as a child, now your brain is still developing, your brain can actually rewire itself and you can have a cognitive disability from that. And I mean, I'm not making excuses for these people, you know, and I have seen this happen in a lot of cases with kids. I'm not making excuses for them, but you know what? My heart really goes out to those children that were mistreated.
Absolutely, no
It
child should
really
be
does,
mistreated. No,
you know? And these people did a lot of drugs, a lot of alcohol. They were self-medicating themselves.
Coping skills.
They had none, you know? And there was mental illness. There was probably a lot of cognitive disability. I'm sure some PTSD as well. So you put that all together, that's a recipe for disaster.
Mm-hmm.
So now I want to talk about the paranormal aspect of it a little bit. So they were having these cult meetings and they were calling in Satan, but who knows what else they were calling through. Now, these lesser, darker entities are drawn to drama. Anything bad, they're drawn to. And if we look at Harbour Terrace, where they had the meetings, there was, you know, drug overdoses, I'm sure suicides, murders, everything you could think of had happened at that housing project. So these darker entities are going to be drawn to that. And the other thing they're drawn to are people that are weak, such as drug addicts and people with mental illness. They're drawn to that. And can they affect these people and make them do things? I really believe that they can.
Mm-hmm.
So who knows if that, could have been part of it, but there is a story. So one of the detectives, they used to go to the meetings sometimes at Sonny's, because Sonny would help them out, and they always got information, and that's how they would find out their little things. And they'd bring their beer and go to the meetings. So one of them claims that one night, Robin was in the bedroom with another young girl, and she was threatening her about something. And he said the voice that came out of her was not a young girl. It was a deep voice of a man. He said it creeped him out so bad, the hairs were up like on his arm.
These detectives were undercover,
Mm-hmm.
I assume.
No, actually, everybody knew they were detectives.
No.
Mm-hmm. But they would go to these meetings, or they'd go to Sonny's house or whatever to try and get info, but they weren't undercover. That was the thing. Yeah,
Wow.
They would just go. But yeah, so I don't know. It just makes you wonder. Just something else that I kind of wanted to look at and talk about. So for part 2, it's gonna be awesome. We're actually going to show you guys some footage. We went out and all of the girls came through. We went to all of the crime scenes. Every single girl came through. So we're going to show you all of that. We're going to try to go to the Freetown State Forest and do a little bit of work there. Explain to you in the next one why I want to do that. But yeah, I think part 2 is going to be intense. It's really intense. So make sure that you guys subscribe to our channel and like if you liked it, and share. That would be great. Hit the notification bell so that you get notifications, and mention in the comments any cases that you think that you would like to see us do, and we'll try our best to do them for you guys. So we'll see you next time.